As my grandmother said when she was crowned, coronations are a declaration of our hopes for the future. And I know she's up there, fondly keeping an eye on us, and she'll be a very proud mother.
On May the 6th, 2022, almost 7 decades after the coronation of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles celebrated his own ancient ritual of coronation.
It was so emotional, and the strong voices and the choir and everybody really meant God save the King. And I think that was extraordinary for Charles.
Well, I think for most people saw the crowning of Charles and the crowning of Camilla as two slightly different things, because everybody has expected Charles to be king one day, and he has been. But with Camilla, it was only relatively recently the idea that we actually had the idea of Queen and Camilla.
I've noticed recently the king that we see in public is very similar to the king that I knew. So that's what's so interesting, is seeing how they're becoming more confident in showing how they are in private.
The full force of Great British pomp and pageantry was on display for the world to see, as this traditional ceremony was brought into the new millennium for the first time.
Well, there was an astonishing amount of pageantry on the day. I mean, it was to watch it, the horse guards parade and the massed ranks of musicians and people on horseback and so forth. It's a reminder that Britain does do pageantry very well. And obviously Charles and Camilla were in their carriage waving around at the public and generally doing what they do best.
From the largest military parade in 70 years to the priceless relics of British history, the coronation was a spectacle to behold, as history was made.
Well, I always thought that Charles would make a wonderful king because he cares so much.
He has waited and waited and waited to become king. But I think there's also a sense of him thinking, okay, I've given this all this thought, now I've got to do it. There's somewhere between terrifying and exhilarating.
The morning of the coronation was rife with anticipation. People from all over the world had set up camp along the procession route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, where the ceremony would take place. In typical English springtime fashion, there was a light drizzle to set the scene, but the weather didn't dampen anyone's excitement for the day ahead.
But what was interesting about the coronation is that, like the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the coronation of George VI, is it was bad weather. And there's always something a bit depressing, because I woke up on the day of coronation and looked outside my window and I thought, oh God, it's miserable, it's wet, it's grey, it's classic English May weather. So that's a bit of a dampener on the spirits, because ultimately the coronation of Charles III has been quite controversial, because he's the oldest English king ever to have been crowned. He's a divisive figure. He's not somebody who's universally popular. He's somebody who's everybody has an opinion about him now.
Crowds began pouring into the viewing areas along the procession route from very early on, and from 9:30 a.m. the VIP guests began arriving at the Abbey. An incredible mix of dignitaries, diplomats, celebrities, politicians, and nobility. Some of these standout arrivals were Olena Vladimirovna Zelenska, First Lady of Ukraine, Jill Biden, First Lady of the United States, and President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Leaders and representatives of the Commonwealth made a symbolic entrance together, flying the flags of their nations. With military precision, at 10:20 a.m., Charles and Camilla left Buckingham Palace in the Diamond Jubilee State Coach. Despite its classical design, this coach is in fact the most modern of all the coaches in the Royal Collection, equipped with air conditioning and hydraulic suspension for a comfortable ride.
Well, there was an astonishing amount of pageantry on the day. I mean, it was to watch it with this parade, the Horse Guards parade and the massed ranks of musicians and people on horseback and so forth. It's a reminder that Britain does do pageantry very well. And obviously Charles and Camilla were in their carriage waving around in the public and generally doing what they do best, or what they should do best anyway. And I mean, what that did was to make people feel that in this rather grim, depressing day, there was this colour and there was this ability to show off, and there was this, the shining of the gold and the red and so on. And so I think that's something that people think is important, because ultimately you've got a coronation, you have to do it whatever the weather. There's no point saying, oh, it's bad weather today, we'll have to postpone a week. You've got this amazing ceremonial event, and it was portrayed in the best possible way in that regard.
After receiving the jubilation of the crowds, Charles and Camilla arrived at the doors of Westminster Abbey at 10:53 a.m. On the occasion of the coronation, it is customary for the king to enter after his queen. Keen spectators would have seen the adorable sight of 9-year-old Prince George, son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, carrying the king's train as one of His Majesty's page boys. With the appropriate fanfare, King Charles III entered the Abbey, and the 2-hour ancient ceremony of worship and appointment would now begin.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history.
The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow.
The late Queen and the King were very close. Her son, she had a wonderful relationship with him. Again, a fun relationship, which we all saw. We used to see different events in London when he would suddenly call her mummy and she'd pull a face at him, and there was a wonderful relationship.
Mummy.
But they respected each other. I mean, he really respected his mother. He respected the fact that she was queen and everything that stood for.
I think that probably the shock of his mother's very sudden death and him becoming king, when these things happen, you go into slight shock, so you act quite mechanically. It sort of protects you in a way. So I think he wouldn't have been overwhelmed at that moment. He would have been very emotional, but he would have kept it all in check. So I think he dealt with it on a very professional level, which would be really the only way to deal with something of that enormity happening to you.
It was very surreal the day after his mother's death to see the King and the Queen's consort return to London. It was very surreal because he was returning as a king.
She made sacrifices for duty. Her dedication and devotion as sovereign never wavered. Through times of change and progress, through times of joy and celebration, and through times of sadness and loss.
Charles has great delivery. I mean, he's practically like a Shakespearean actor. Well, he was a Shakespearean actor at one time. So his delivery of all these speeches is completely brilliant. And I think he writes most of them himself. And he delivers it with superb timing and superb emotion.
Outside the royal court, the state trumpets sound. Before rolling news, the role of this part of the ceremony was to spread the word to a waiting nation.
The Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III. God save the King!
There was an extraordinary outpouring of grief amongst the nation because, you know, the majority of the Queen's subjects had never known another monarch. And it was kind of the end of an era. It wasn't just her death, it was the end of an era. It was end of the Elizabethan age as we know it. And of course, it was all so dramatic and so beautifully staged that made it even more poignant. The first rendition in St. George's Chapel of God Save the King, I think he nearly lost it because it was so emotional, and the strong voices and the choir and everybody really, really meant God Save the King. And I think that was extraordinary for Charles.
I know he'll be a good king. He'll be a caring king, a compassionate king. He'll be a king for the people.
Well, I always thought that Charles would make a wonderful king because he cares so much. He cares about his country, he cares about its heritage, he cares about the planet, and he cares about the people. And I think that that's really the attributes you need for a king. He is perfect. But with Camilla at his side, I think he is going to be wonderful and compassionate and understanding and all the things that he needs to be.
The first part of the coronation is known as the recognition. The monarch presents himself to his people in an ancient tradition dating back to the Anglo-Saxon era. In turn, they say, "I here present unto you King Charles, your undoubted king. Wherefore, all you who are come this day to do your homage and service, are you willing to do the same?" The congregation and choir replies, "God save King Charles." In fact, Charles's first words upon arriving at the altar of Westminster Abbey are a pledge of service and devotion to his people. Next is the oath. Charles is presented with a Bible crafted by 40 expert craftspeople. With his hand on the Bible, he swears to protect the faith, the Church of England. Next is the King's Prayer. The King kneels before the high altar and recites his own specially written prayer, another first for this coronation. The words were inspired by the hymn, "I Vow to Thee My Country." Charles asks God, "that I may be a blessing to all thy children, of every faith and conviction, that together we may discover the ways of gentleness." Next, and perhaps the holiest moment of the entire coronation, is the anointing. The anointing with holy oil is the central act of the religious ceremony and takes place in private. Charles III's holy oil was made sacred in Jerusalem and consecrated by the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Anglican Archbishop in Jerusalem. It was created using olives harvested from 2 groves on the Mount of Olives and pressed just outside Bethlehem, and perfumed with sesame, rose, jasmine, cinnamon, neroli, benzoin, amber, and orange blossom. Charles's robe of state is taken off, leaving him in simple clothing, showing his humility to God. Then, in the most awe-inspiring moment of it all, the choir sing the magnificent Zadok the Priest, written by Handel.
Well, Zadok the Priest, Bob by Handel, is one of the greatest pieces of classical music ever written, and the opportunity to hear it being played at Westminster Abbey is something that everybody should have at least once, and to be able to watch during the coronation service, when you have it being played at full volume with the best orchestra, the best choir imaginable, is a truly stirring moment. The thing that it is accompanying is the anointing of the new king, and the problem is, the anointing of the new king is something which is a slightly silly moment, because we hear all these things about the sacred oils being used, so forth. You think, it sounds like a really expensive spa treatment. And on the one hand, you can look at this image of Charles, with his finery off, wearing this linen shirt, and it's actually quite a moving image for this now quite old man who's having these things done to him. On the other hand, there is an essential ridiculousness to it, which I think we can't really ignore. And I wonder, when it comes to William becoming king, is he going to look at a lot of these things that his father did and think, actually, I don't want that because I think it's absurd? But then, of course, the traditionalism argument kicks in and people say, well, why would you ditch all this? Because what was interesting about the coronation is, compared to Elizabeth II's, which went on for about 3 hours, it was a very stripped-down service. The major meat of it, if you like, took just over an hour. So it wasn't something which was a lavish, pageant as coronations in years gone by have been. But I think it's likely that when William becomes king, it'll be even less devoted to ceremonialism and so on.
The investiture follows. Now the screen is removed and King Charles III is presented with garments and regalia, including the iconic orb and scepter, and of course the moment everyone was waiting for, the coronation crown. At exactly noon, St. Edward's crown is placed upon Charles's head by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Made of solid gold in 1661, this elaborate crown is encrusted with 444 jewels and weighs 5 pounds. Now the king moves to take seat on the throne of England, a velvet-covered chair made for George VI in 1937. First to kneel before the king and swear his allegiance is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Then, in a very touching moment, the Prince of Wales, Prince William, kneels before the king and pledges his loyalty before kissing his father the king on the cheek.
Well, one of the most affecting moments for me during the service was when Prince of Wales pledges his allegiance to his father and says, "I will be your liege man," which is called this term of great association. It's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And Charles seemed deeply affected throughout the service. He's a man who is very much a traditionalist. He's very much somebody who has been waiting for this for decades. But the moment where his son came to him and kissed him on the cheek and pledged his allegiance was, I think, the moment he seemed most moved of all, because the relationship between Charles and William has been much debated. It has been said that Charles is jealous of William because William and Kate are seen as younger, more glamorous, more exciting than him and Camilla. And there's also very much a sense for a lot of people that when the monarchy changes, it will be William who is at the forefront of that change, that Charles is a kind of caretaker monarch. And Charles is a man who's aware of all this. He is somebody who will have been told about this by private secretaries, and I think there has been something of a sidelining of Prince William in the run-up to the coronation, but that moment made it very clear, both symbolically and practically, but especially when compared to the relationship between King Charles and Prince Harry, who was, as they say, present but not involved at the coronation, that the relationship between the king and the king-to-be was a strong one, and I think that most people found that as affecting as I did.
I, William, Prince of Wales, pledge my loyalty to you, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, as your liege man of life and limb. So help me God.
Next to be crowned is the Queen. Sitting in the same chair of estate that she's been using throughout the service so far, the Queen is anointed with holy oil. She touches the ruby consort's ring, made for Queen Adelaide in 1831, and last used in 1937 by Queen Elizabeth, the old Queen Mother. The Archbishop then crowns her.
Well, I think that most people saw the crowning of Charles and the crowning of Camilla as two slightly different things, because everybody has expected Charles to be king one day, and he has been. But with Camilla, it was only relatively recently the idea that we actually had the idea of Queen Camilla, because certainly Prince Philip was never King Philip, and it was often suspected that Camilla would have been the Queen Consort or given some title that was not quite the same thing. And I think what was very nice on the day was watching her, and she was exhibiting an obvious and very human nervousness, because if you were in that position, you'd be nervous, and it was quite clear that for all of her decades in the public eye, for her 15 years being married to Charles, and for generally having prepared for this herself, the reality of it was still an overwhelming thing. And I think that Queen Camilla is actually one of the most beloved royals. She's somebody who I think people like because she's seen as accessible, and she's seen as somebody you can actually relate to, unlike a lot of her adopted family. And you think to yourself, I'm very glad that she was able to rise to the occasion on the day.
The king's public persona and private persona are very similar. Obviously, there has to be it's slightly different, because I've always said that it doesn't matter what you do in life, you act it. You always have to act and do it. But more or less what you see is very much how he is behind closed doors. He's very similar. I've noticed recently the prince or the king that we see in public is very similar to the prince or king that I knew. So that's what's so interesting, is seeing how they're becoming more confident in showing how they are in private, which is fantastic. And we get so much inside footage now that we never used to get. So we see private audiences and meetings and all sorts of things that we would never have seen, 20, 30 years ago. So that's why it makes it easier to say to people, well, the man, the king that I knew or know is the same as the king that you see, because that is what you see is how he is.
Well, he was a very studious child. I mean, he was somebody who was quite unlike Prince Philip, who was a much more boisterous character. He was unlike his mother as well. His mother was somebody who was very serious from a very young age, and Charles, I think, inherited this seriousness, but what he had, which she didn't have, was a real interest in learning and a real interest in books and things like that. This is seen as quite anomalous, because members of the royal family are not traditionally seen as intellectuals, but Charles, I think, was seen as somebody who had intellectual ideas and interests, possibly inculcated in him from his nannies from a very young age.
Well, Queen Elizabeth was a very dutiful mother, and if you think that she became queen aged 25, she had, Prince Charles was, I think, he was 4, nearly, and Princess Anne was she was born in 1950, so she was only just 3 when the Queen was crowned. So basically her children were taken away from her. She just didn't have time to be with them. So she would see them in the morning, for 15 minutes, and she would see them at night for half an hour. But again, you have to judge it by the mores of the time. That was how aristocratic families worked.
Almost exactly 7 decades earlier, on the 2nd of June 1953, Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her coronation.
When the coronation took place in 1953, it was quite interesting, because Charles was obviously just about old enough to be at the coronation and to have an understanding of what was going on in a way that none of his siblings who were currently born did. And I suspect that for a very young boy, it would have been an overwhelming experience. I mean, the pageantry, the noise, the sheer number of people. But there would also have been, probably by then, at the back of his mind, this thought percolating about, it's going to be me one day, this is all going to happen for me.
It was a 3-hour ceremony. It was, everybody recalls, the coldest June day that had ever happened. And it was pouring with rain. And people, there was, if you go back, this is 1953, so the army was enormous. And they had every sort of foot or 2 feet along the pavement, there was what they call streetliners, which were soldiers. And they were all really cold, and they were given sugar lumps infused with brandy to sort of keep them going. And the ceremony itself was very, very serious and very religious and very dramatic.
And it's impossible to speculate exactly how he would have felt, because we have no record of his thoughts of a time, and I doubt very much he remembers exactly how it was. But certainly, it must have been a sense of absolutely terrifying pressure being put on you as a young child to see all this at such a young age, and to think, one day, unless something horrible happens or unexpected, this will all be for me as well. Well, obviously he was the eldest sibling of 4, and I think it's fair to say that because he was the first sibling, and because he was going to be Prince of Wales and then eventually he was going to become king, there was always a sense that he was the one who was given the most attention and the most focus. So I think this was something that he, on the one hand, he thrived on, because who wouldn't thrive in a situation where you're always told that you're the most important one?
So the king served the longest apprenticeship, I think, in history as Prince of Wales, and I suppose you might think that he was frustrated maybe, or you get to a point when you want to do the job, and from my view that was never the case. He enjoyed being Prince of Wales. He did an amazing job. There'd never been a Prince of Wales that had more or less created it into an actual job, and that's what he did. He made it an actual job.
I'm delighted to say we've got a new member of our weather team tonight. Let me hand over to him now. Your Highness.
Well, it's an unsettled picture as we head towards the end of the week. This afternoon it'll be cold, wet and windy across most of Scotland. We're under the influence of low pressure, and this weather front pushing northwards is bringing cloud and outbreaks of rain. The rain, of course, will be heaviest over the borders and around Edinburgh, where it could lead to difficult conditions on the roads. In the west, rain will be lighter and patchier. There will maybe a few drier interludes over Dumfries House in Ayrshire. Aha! There'll be snow for the higher ground of the Highlands and Aberdeenshire. The potential for a few flurries over Balmoral. Who the hell wrote this script? As the afternoon goes on. The best of the drier and brighter weather will, of course, be over the Northern Isles and the far north of the mainland. So a little hazy sunshine for the Castle of May and Caithness, but a cold day everywhere with temperatures of just 8 Celsius and a brisk northeasterly wind. Thank God it isn't a bank holiday.
Well, what Charles has done throughout his life is, in addition to his conventional royal responsibilities, he's had a real interest in making a difference in the lives of younger people. And so the major thing he's known for is Prince's Trust, which is this organisation which specialises in giving out funding to disadvantaged organisations and individuals and trying to make their lives better. And the thing about the Prince's Trust is that it's a brilliant idea. He's had the public persona and the ability to actually make it work. And so it's one of those things that even people who don't like the royal family and even people who have Republican sentiments would usually agree that Prince's Trust has been a force for good. And I think that what you can see in Charles is genuine desire to make things better for people. I mean, he genuinely is somebody who has said, I worry about the fate of my subjects. And I think that's true. I think he does. I mean, he doesn't always get it right, but none of us would. And I think that the Prince's Trust and Prince's Foundation are real concrete steps to actually helping people's lives.
So when I created the Prince's Trust in 1976 to help improve the lives of disadvantaged young people, it was because I was so acutely aware of the challenges that they faced. And over the years, some of the challenges have changed, but the overall mission of giving people self-confidence, self-esteem, and better opportunities remains the same. And in that time, we have helped over 1 million young people. And I always used to get so annoyed that it hadn't got to 1 million long ago, because we had to keep counting people who were still going through the system, even though we were actually helping 50,000 people a year. I thought, I know my maths is bad, but... So we've helped over 1 million young people transform their lives, and the Prince's Trust now works in 18 countries across the Commonwealth and beyond.
I would like to take this opportunity to say to you, Charles, how proud I am of everything you have accomplished with the Trust. and the way you personally have inspired this organisation. It is a very great pleasure for me, therefore, to present a Royal Charter to the Prince's Trust in recognition of its outstanding achievements over nearly a quarter of a century.
It's totally useless for a lot of well-meaning people to wring their hands in conference and to point out the dangers of pollution or destruction of the countryside if no one is willing or capable of taking any action. The impassioned speeches will be so much effluent under the bridge unless it is followed by drastic political action. Well, sir, time is fast running out, and it remains to be seen whether those in political authority can shoulder their responsibilities in time and act quickly enough to relieve a situation which grows more serious every day.
Well, Prince Philip is somebody who was always interested in the ecology, but Prince Charles has taken it several steps further. And now that he's king, it's been quite interesting because for years he was mocked by the media for saying things like you should talk to your trees and things like that. But now that we understand things like climate change and we're all much more aware of the environment, we can see Charles was actually decades ahead of us because he was somebody who's always taken this stuff seriously. He's always warned about global warming. He's always warned about climate change. And now I think we can actually say, yep, you were right. You've always understood this.
Ladies and gentlemen, the battle against climate change is surely the most defining and pivotal challenge of our times. Even in a world full of daunting perils and crises, it is hard to imagine anything that poses a greater challenge and opportunity for humanity. We are running out of time. How many times have I found myself saying this over recent years? We cannot delay, regroup, prevaricate, or wait for more and better information. We should compare the planet under threat of climate change to a sick patient. No doctor would wait for 100% certainty while a dying patient slipped away. We cannot ignore the symptoms and should act now to restore the health of the planet before it is too late.
Learning the job, you know, he learnt the job from his mother and father. His education was always about preparing him for the day that he became king. I don't think anyone would ever imagined that he'd been Prince of Wales for as long as he was, but it's put him in a really good place of understanding the country and the world we're in today. So I think if you would say to me, is he the best man for the job? I think it's safe to say yes, he is, because he has done an amazing bit of training. And as the Queen once said, famously said that training is everything. At the end of the day, that's the answer to everything. And it's true. It is the answer to everything, as that training that her son had has now put him into a job that he can undertake.
The spectacle was on full display for the parade return to Buckingham Palace as the newly anointed King and Queen. The crowds were jubilant in their celebrations. The traditional gold state coach that was used was infamously criticised by Queen Victoria, who described it as akin to riding in a ship on rough seas.
What's always quite funny is that when you're watching the coverage of something like this on television, the crowds become sort of rent a crowd. I mean, everyone's got their flags and waving them about. But I suppose you're not going to be watching it and thinking, well, I was looking forward to it, I'm really disappointed. I mean, you can't imagine there being mass booing and things like that as everybody leaves. People really enjoyed it, and I think it was something that even in the rain, even in the misery, there's still a sense of, oh, it went well.
On returning to the palace, the military forces that led the processions were positioned on the lawn of Buckingham Palace in preparation for an appearance of the king. This allowed all those taking part the opportunity to salute their new king in the flesh, as many wouldn't have seen him until this moment.
Majesty's Armed Forces! Royal Salute! Resist! Arms!
And finally, no royal event is complete without the famous balcony appearance.
Well, I think when King Charles was standing on the Buckingham Palace balcony and waving down at his people, there was a look on his face, and it was quite hard to tell. Well, for one hand, it was, oh, thank God that's all over. And it was quite clear. You could see it's a tiring day. I mean, with the eyes of the world upon you, it's very hard not to be exhausted and then to be happy thinking, oh, only another few minutes of this. But there's also a sense, I think, that he has waited and waited and waited to become king. Decades he's been waiting for this. I mean, it's impossible to put a time on it, but let's say from the mid-1980s, this has been something that he's been expecting, so about 40 years. And you think to yourself, you have wanted this in various forms, and you thought about this, and now it's happened. And it inevitably is going to be an anticlimax, because you cannot wait for half your adult life for something, and then it not be. But I think there's also a sense of him of thinking, okay, I've given this all this thought, now I've got to do it. There's somewhere between terrifying and exhilarating.
The celebrations continued for what was a triumphant weekend in the United Kingdom and around the globe. A special coronation concert took place the following day on the grounds of Windsor Castle. This star-studded event featured performances from legends such as Lionel Richie and Katy Perry. Prince William also made a very moving speech in tribute to his father.
Good evening, Your Majesties. Good evening, Windsor. A huge thank you to everyone for making this such a special evening. I want to say a few words about my father and why I believe this weekend is so important. But don't worry, unlike Lionel, I won't go on all night long. As my grandmother said when she was crowned, coronations are a declaration of our hopes for the future. And I know she's up there, fondly keeping an eye on us, and she'll be a very proud mother. For all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service. My father's first words on entering Westminster Abbey yesterday were a pledge of service. It was a pledge to continue to serve, because for over 50 years, in every corner of the UK, across the Commonwealth and around the world, he has dedicated himself to serve others, both current and future generations, and those whose memory must not be neglected. Take the natural world. He warned us of the risks to our planet's health long before it was an everyday issue. Or the Prince's Trust. It has supported... The Prince's Trust has supported over 1 million young people, many from disadvantaged backgrounds, to realise their ambitions. And perhaps most importantly of all, my father has always understood that people of all faiths, all backgrounds, and all communities deserve to be celebrated and supported. Pa, we are all so proud of you. And I also want to express my pride and gratitude for the millions of people who serve in the forces, in classrooms, hospital wards, and local communities. I wish I could mention you all. Your service inspires us, and tonight we celebrate you too. I commit myself to serve you all, King, country, and Commonwealth. God save the King.
The coronation is complete, and now, in the eyes of God, the reign of King Charles III has officially begun.